Okay, welcome back to another episode of Litigious, the number one podcast in the world for discussion of legal topics in the news. As always, I'm Scott Peterson here with Giovanna today. This podcast is brought to you by Durazio Peterson, a plaintiff's litigation firm in New York, Massachusetts, and Vermont. If you like the show, please subscribe, like, and share it with a friend. This week, we are talking about internet responses to events and the implications of those in a legal sense and in an employment sense in particular. And we're recording this on September 11th, and obviously, as of this recording, the biggest story in the news is the unfortunate assassination of Charlie Kirk, a commentator, debater, and close political ally of Donald Trump and the conservative movement. This is not a politics podcast. The discussion of the strengths and weaknesses of Charlie Kirk's arguments can be left for another forum. From our perspective, obviously, this is not acceptable. I think most people agree with that. Everyone should agree with that. And you're at a minimum, you feel sympathy for the family and for those, close to him. So it's certainly not a great day for a number of reasons in American history, yesterday or today. But it does serve as an opportunity, I think, for us to kind of talk about some of the things that we always talk about in the context of social media, the internet, and in particular, how they relate to legal claims and in even more particular, how they relate to the world of employment law, which is one of the areas of our practice. And so I think as we start today, we'll talk about two immediate reactions to the Charlie Kirk's death and how it was handled by some folks online and what the implications of that were. So before I get into that, anything you have, or do you want me to get into the first story?
You can get into the first story.
All right. So first, MSNBC has fired an analyst, uh, Matthew Dowd, who I think has been with them for a while. I don't watch cable news on either side as a matter of uh, self-preservation. But Matthew Dowd, who I've seen before, um, made some comments about Charlie Kirk having had hateful thoughts, which led to hateful words, which then led to hateful actions. So apparently he made these comments on air last night and was terminated today for those comments. Second, and we'll talk about both before we get into the other piece of this, is that the Carolina Panthers, an NFL football team, fired an employee today after the employee made a social media post about the shooting saying, quote, "Why are y'all sad? Your man said it was worth it." And in the next slide of his post, he posted a photo of Kirk, and then included a reference to the Wu-Tang Clan song "Protect Your Neck," uh, and was summarily fired as well by the Carolina Panthers. So if you've been online in the last 24 hours, you've seen probably an outpouring of support, and then the inevitable devolving of the internet into camps and tribes and disgusting speech, frankly, on both sides. So, what do you think about these two individuals and the consequences of their actions?
I think that the two situations are pretty different. Um, the Carolina Panthers one, I mean, we talk about this a lot. You are an employee, your social media is a reflection often on your employer, whether you're thinking of it in that way or not. And that was very, those were like almost jokes. They were, clearly insensitive. The thing about with the neck, I mean, this is not appropriate. So I think in that situation, I'm not surprised that you would get fired for that, especially, this is like such a big, gigantic news story right now. The MSNBC one, I think, like all these huge networks are capitulating to, I think they appear to have be capitulating sort of to President Trump in general, and they seem to be very cautious about getting, stepping on his toes. The context in which he said that was in response to a question about the political climate of today, not really. Obviously it was in the context of Charlie Kirk being murdered, but it was not like, yes, could you have taken that in its worst possible connotation to say that I think the absolute worst possible connotation would have been to say that he like deserved it somehow by contributing to this culture of hate that we are living in some ways. I don't think that is what he meant. I really don't. I mean, I read it, I like read it in the context of it. I think one of the problems that we're probably going to talk about is, or that we are talking about, is that with social media and then with a 24-hour news cycle, people are speaking on things that they have not had a chance to fully digest and answer questions. I mean, social media is a little bit different because you're more in control of it. Like you yourself are spitting all this stuff out into the universe. Now, if you're a talking head on a cable news channel and somebody asks you a question and you have to be answering in real time and thinking on your feet, maybe you say something that's not as thoughtful or doesn't come out exactly how you would have liked it to be. I think that's a little bit different than the Panthers one, where you are fully responsible for putting this out in the universe. Nobody asked you a question. Nobody wants to hear from you. You're just throwing it out there. So I kind of think those two things are a little bit different. I think probably anybody being very prudent in that moment, speaking publicly, probably is going to try hard not to insinuate that this was a product of a culture that he contributed to, at least on the day of. That's probably is a legitimate conversation later on, not that he deserved it, but that I think many people are complicit in the current culture. There have been Democratic lawmakers and people who have also been murdered for political reasons. So, there is a conversation to be had about why are we in this situation and who bears some responsibility for it. But, in the day of, sometimes it is okay to just say either to not speak at all, or to say this is tragic.
Yeah, the two are different. I agree with you. But I do think it does lead to some of the same sort of overarching ideas. And I think you're correct. I think one of them is exactly what you said, which is in the immediate aftermath of an event like this, I don't think it's wise for anyone to just start blaming, because the reality of this is that this wasn't performed unless there's some massive conspiracy. It wasn't performed by a particular political party or a particular movement. It was
Well,
performed
they
by
haven't
some.
caught this person, right?
No,
So
they
this is
have,
all
and
speculation of what the
yeah, and that's my point, is this was done by someone in all likelihood with a severe, you know, problem individually, and that is an issue that has to be dealt with. But I think that the common theme really is that you, when you work for someone else, you don't have any, and that is a private entity, you don't have any expectation of free speech. And if you say something that they don't agree with, you absolutely can be terminated from your job. And I think about this in more in the social media sense, because like you said, you know, Dowd's comments were different, but he also worked for a company, and if they don't agree with his comments, whether it's capitulation or whether they legitimately believe that they were insensitive comments, it really doesn't matter. They're a private company, and they can fire someone for saying something they don't agree with, or they don't think was good for business, or they don't think was good for their relationship with advertisers. That happens all the time. The social media stuff is what I find interesting is, you see all these people online, and again, left and right, saying some pretty insensitive things today. And all I can think to myself is like, you have no real context into what caused this to happen, or what the particular shooter in this case, what the affiliation was, and you're spouting all of this crazy, hatred. And if you work for a company, I would feel the same way. This doesn't represent, our ideals as a company. And so I think it's very short-sighted for people to get online and start spewing these kinds of comments without any consideration of what the implications are in their, you know, professional or business or employment lives, right? It's like there's no legal protection for this, and at least in most cases. And so when you see somebody like this guy in the Panthers get fired, it's like this is yeah. I mean, it's a private organization in the NFL. Like they care a lot about their image, I would imagine, and the last thing they want is this. Now, you get people who think, well, I should have the right to say whatever I want. It's my personal platform. Why can't I say that? And it always goes back to what we say, which is, sure, you can say it. The government's not preventing you from saying it. Your company is not preventing you from saying it. It's just that there are consequences for what you say. And so, I think it's a sad commentary on a lot of the state of our current discourse, at a minimum.
I'll just add a little bit of legal context. So, like you said, if you work for a private employer, you don't have any First Amendment protection. First Amendment is for some public employers, very limited in terms of what your First Amendment protection is in even a public workplace. And then it's the obvious of, the government can't throw you in jail for, your speech typically. But the only times that employees of a private business can sometimes have a little bit of protection, and it wouldn't be under the First Amendment, and it would be under the National Labor Relations Act, is if you are making some type of concerted speech on behalf of a group of employees, that could potentially fall under some kind of whistleblower protection. But yeah, for the most part, you've decided to chime in on something controversial, you've said something inappropriate. I mean, you know, this is kind of like a strange situation because, I think Charlie Kirk positioned himself as sort of a free speech person. But like you said, there are some people who can do that without an employment consequence and say, things on their podcast or say, things on social media, and they're sort of safe from employment consequences because for someone like him, he had a podcast and that was sort of his whole brand, was saying things. I'm sure a lot of the things that he said or that a lot of politicians say or that a lot of podcasters say are things that you or I would actually not be able to, or well, we are self-employed, but that another, employee might not be able to say without consequences. And I think that, it's just, we have a few different articles that are much more sort of substantive deep dive into this topic if somebody is interested on our website. But I think what we always say is that when we are in sort of a turbulent situation, we saw this during COVID, we saw it during Black Lives Matter, we see it with the Israel-Palestine. I know that it can feel like sometimes silence is complicit, but you don't always have to weigh in on everything. Especially when all of the information is not available. And I think with social media, it can put sort of a fire under people to feel like they have to weigh in on something right away. So in this situation, you sort of had people on both sides, people who felt like, they felt some obligation to point out that, this man had a lot of problematic opinions for a lot of people that people felt were harmful, and potentially, ironically, that would have incited violence against other people. But then you had, obviously people who kind of took it one step farther than just saying this is a tragedy and this is wrong. And political violence has no, we don't appreciate that, or we can't condone that. But then kind of, you know, went farther and basically, I would say, confirmed to the world, even if they had never really done that previously, that this man was sort of a hero of theirs. And he was had some complicated, controversial opinions. So perhaps a bit thoughtlessly, some people out there may have, for the first time, sent a signal to the world and to their colleagues and to their friends of where their true beliefs may lie. And that's okay, but I think that, this is definitely a situation where I felt like I saw some things being said on, both sides. People, I don't think it's a time for jokes. I don't think it's a time for like memes. I don't think it's a time for saying you deserved it, because nobody deserves that. I actually put him in the category of a victim of a school shooting, which is, for me, is like my number one passion of, being something that is put in the past. So, but so I completely think it's perfectly fine for somebody like the Carolina Panthers guy to be fired for that. On the flip side of it, I think it has been noticed when this person is being canonized.
Yeah, I think your point earlier was right. I think a lot of this is that people get a lot of their information nowadays from sources that tend to be fairly opinionated and strong in their opinions. And I think there's a feeling that's probably not accurate among a lot of people on social media in particular that, you know, because the sources that they're hearing from feel free to speak their mind openly, that they can do the same without consequence. And this is just another reminder that if you work for someone or a company, you can't do that for the most part. And that's just, like it or not, that is the reality of the legal system and the laws protecting speech as it relates to the private sector. And so, yeah, I think you're right. The other thing is, I mean, I I think it's just, people say things too quickly, right? We're lawyers, we're trained to be cautious with words, most of us, and try to be like more nuanced in the way we say things. But even lawyers spout off without thinking about it, and that has consequences. So, we don't need to belabor this, other than the point of this conversation was that, again, a reminder that when somebody says First Amendment, First Amendment, First Amendment, that doesn't protect you from your your company seeing something that you wrote that they thought was vitriolic or, you know, distasteful in a way that poorly reflected on them and firing you for it. And so, people should remember that. And I'll just move on to the next topic, which is somewhat related. Speaking of the internet and social media responding uh, in some ways appropriately, and then as per the usual, going over the top, which is this story of the Phillies Karen, as she has become known, and the fallout. So, backstory of this is that there was a home run hit at a game between the Phillies and the Miami Marlins. A guy caught a ball and was going to give it to his son on his son's birthday, and this woman went and took the ball away.
Wait,
And
did you say the dad caught the ball?
yeah, isn't that right?
Well, I mean, the woman would say he didn't. I don't know. I'm
All
not
right.
defending her. She did not behave appropriately, but I did see other. I tried to watch the video. I like could not see where the ball was. So she was. I think the way I understood it is that she was potentially like hit with the ball and like was maybe like reaching down to get it, and like the guy swooped in and grabbed it.
Okay.
So do you know that this happened to me at a Mets game?
Yes, I believe so.
Yes, when I was in law school, I worked at a Wall Street firm one summer, and they always like wine you and dine you. So we get to sit in like one of the nice boxes at a Mets game. And I was hit like softly with a foul ball, but being like not interested um in the sporting event, I was like chit-chatting with the person next to me and having a drink, and I just allowed it to sort of like roll away. So I would not have then gone and tried to fight someone who had picked up the ball.
Well, you're
That
also not a Philly
lady.
sports fan. No offense to our.
I know my brother would have probably appreciated the Mets ball though.
So anyway, she's been targeted online, and in the typical internet fashion, it's gone completely over the top, and she's received threats and threats of break-ins in her house, and I think death threats. So much
I
so
don't
that
know who this is though. She hasn't actually been accurately identified.
yeah, except the father was so worried about this woman's well-being that he came out and said that he had to encourage fans not to rise up and do anything to her. So,
Well, this worked out in their favor because I feel like they are got invited to the World Series or something. I think somebody like gave them money, gave him another ball. I don't know. But I think one of the things we were going to say though is when things sort of blow up on social media, you have these everybody sort of rushing and feeling this sense of urgency to say something and whatever before you have time to figure things out. And, they outed someone who or misidentified someone. Her school district had to issue a statement and be like, this person does not work here. This is not, you know, whatever, that like this is the wrong person. And then another woman who got identified had to come out and same thing, say this wasn't me. By the way, I'm a Red Sox fan. Like, and it's just, I think it goes back to some of the Charlie Kirk stuff also, which is that not everyone has to jump in on every single thing. And you can end up genuinely harming someone, even if it's in a more seems a little bit funny situation. It happened in the Coldplay Jumbotron thing too. They identified this woman that was with the couple as being an employee in the firm, and they're circulating somebody's LinkedIn profile as the wrong person. So, you have to be careful because I think even there's been examples in the past as well of like people who do the public shaming, then it comes back around on them because you can certainly take things too far. I remember there was a story there. I feel like even before social media blew up even more, there was a handful of like famous public shaming cases. And it was like the woman who was on the flight to Africa and made a joke about HIV. And by the time she got there, she was like fired from her job and all this stuff. And then there was the guy who's kind of made a racist comment about his coworker's like son, and that, turned into this huge thing. But then one of the ones that I always kind of went back to was there was a woman, and I'm totally against this because I think this is like another societal problem that we have is people recording everybody. And I understand that, there's people who are exhibiting bad behavior and maybe you could say, oh, they get what they deserve. But I do have a little bit of a problem about everybody filming everybody because you don't know, like somebody has a bad day, they don't act the right way. I don't think they deserve to always have their life ruined because stood. I just saw one the other day of like somebody who stood up first on the plane and went to the front. I mean, I understand people don't like that and you're not supposed to do that and it's bad etiquette, but like, do you need to be filmed? I mean, the last flight that we took, I remember I was like fuming because a guy blocked me in my seat and didn't let me out. And I was like, I didn't get my phone out and start videotaping him and public shaming him. So I think that can go too far. But there was this woman who overheard in front of her at a conference two men having sort of a sexist conversation. And she videotaped, or she recorded them, and she disseminated this. She sent it to their job. These people they ended up getting fired, but she ruined their lives. Like, one of the men, like, he was like supporting his family. And it wasn't like these were people who were acting on their word. They had a conversation that this woman perceived as being inappropriate. That blew up in a way that went right back on her, and she was fired. So I just think a lot of this is kind of like, take a deep breath. I never spoke about when we're talking about political violence, something horrific happened was it Minnesota? And that was like everybody's, worst nightmare of some masked psychopath coming into your home and a home invasion. And that is known to have been political. And I remember when it first happened, a lot of people were calling it out, but it hadn't been really confirmed yet. And, I personally, that's something that I would have maybe made a comment about, but just kind of didn't say anything because it wasn't confirmed. And then by the time it was, it sort of passed, and it not that it should not be forgotten, but it didn't necessarily feel appropriate to say something about it or timely. But I think that's okay. Like, sometimes you can just say, even though, other people in my peers or other of people in the same, political views as me are all speaking out about the same thing, like, you don't always have to feel like you need to add your voice to that if you haven't had the time to really digest it and think about how you're going to do this, like, in a thoughtful way.
Yeah, and I think the other part of that is going back to the theme of, what you say online can get you into trouble. You can envision a scenario where someone who's threatening this Phillies this Phillies Karen makes a crazy threatening post online. If that person works for me, I'm probably going to fire them, because that's crazy behavior. And so, it goes back to like actions having consequences, and legally not having protections for this kind of behavior. And that's
And
sort of been what's
oh,
that?
sorry. No, I was going to say, and just in terms of the employment part of it, we tell people all the time in our job when we do consultations, most people, and in New York, certainly most people are at will employees, which means that you can be fired for any reason unless you fall within some sort of specific legal protection. And the really, only legal protections for most employees are under, Title VII, which would be the, sex discrimination, race, the ADA, disability discrimination, age discrimination, certain types of whistleblower laws, but those are pretty limited as well. And certain types of union or concerted type of activity. But that's really it. Your political views are not protected. New York has a very narrowly tailored statute, but it does not cover generalized political beliefs. And it certainly doesn't cover stuff that just demonstrates really poor judgment that reflects poorly on your business. Because the other thing that people need to be aware of in this day and age, with I think they sometimes forget, is that you're very easy to find. So if you're going on a rampage about something, so say for example, feel really passionately that, somebody is your hero and that person is kind of a problematic person. You work for a company that has clients, and they see that and they say, well, this person that you're saying is your hero is, racist or a misogynist. Like, maybe I'm going to take my business away from your firm, or I'm just going to call them up and be like, hey, did you see that your, boy over here is going on a rampage, you have to be conscious of that. I certainly think it's appropriate for people to speak thoughtfully on basically whatever they want. But I think from what I've seen the last couple days, I think, it's, sometimes you got to stop and think for a little bit about what does this mean?
Yeah, I totally agree. Nuance has gone out the door in a lot of cases here. But moving on to our non sequitur. So the CEO of Nestle was fired for having a relationship with a subordinate employee. Uh, Interestingly, the relationship was brought to light because what happened?
Well, he had two mistresses and a wife, and his first mistress, who's also worked for the company but was at a higher level, discovered him in bed. Like this is I wish there was like a camera crew who had followed this. Discovered him in bed in a hotel. How did she find them? I don't know. How did she have
Oh,
access to the room? Like I
it
have
was
so
in
many
Zurich,
questions.
in Zurich, Switzerland.
Um, Found him with another employee of the company, um, who was, I think, a more significant subordinate. And you know how they say like hell hath no fury, like a woman scorned. So this lady got all her ducks in a row. She went to the anonymous whistleblower tip line. As this is going on, she negotiates her own exit package. This blows up. He gets fired, no severance package. She's out, new company, her own severance
Yeah.
package.
The news article I read referred to her as the main mistress.
Oh, the main
The
mistress.
main mistress. So it's interesting because typically when a CEO leaves a big company, in most cases they've got a contract which provides for, some kind of a severance, or if they're leaving, if they're fired, in many cases you'll see the company providing them with a severance package for a number of reasons, not the least of which is that included within severance packages are, releases from potential legal claims, sometimes non-competes, non-solicitations, etc. Uh, he didn't get any of that. So my suspicion, I could be wrong, is that he had a contract which probably did provide for I mean, Nestle's a huge company, probably a very lucrative severance payout, but he probably violated one of the terms of the contract, which
And
was
they said they called him like a liar.
yeah, there's probably some kind of morality type clause in there, which says basically if you act in a way that hurts the company's image or in a way that's not in line with the company's quote unquote morality, you sacrifice your right to a severance. So that's a pretty
Like, where's
aggressive
the wife?
move.
Like, what's the wife? Where's the wife? Like,
Well,
what's
yeah, this might, yeah, well, I
you
mean,
get the prenup? That's what we talked
yeah,
about last episode.
yeah.
Hopefully, she gets the prenup,
So,
adultery penalty in there.
yeah, yeah, well, this is a lesson that, from the theme of the episode, again, from a low-ish level employee for the Carolina Panthers to the CEO of Nestle, no one's immune from, bad behavior or excuse me, consequences from bad behavior when you work for a private company. And he was, if he had a contract, then he probably violated it. If he didn't have a contract, he was at will. And so, that's sort of been our theme is, all of these types of things have consequences, and we see this all the time. The company's lucky they didn't get sued, although it sounds like they at least had to resolve a potential lawsuit with the main mistress. Not sure about the secondary mistress, but I would imagine everybody except for the CEO
Well, I would
got a
say
resolution there.
most likely person to retain their job is secondary mistress because she's the most junior,
Yeah.
the boss. Um, so, but yeah, and I mean, and even the Phillies, Karen, it was fake news that she was fired, but I think that was an example, not somebody who made a thoughtless social media post, but just being conscious in this day and age of your behavior because your out of the office behavior, you can be fired for that, that somebody does something, you're a poor reflection on the company. They get, like I said, in this day and age, people are very easy to find. And your company gets, hey, look at your employee out here behaving poorly. And they get calls and boycotts and things like that. I mean, like we said before, I think that can go too far sometimes. But it's definitely something, to keep in mind. Um, that you really don't have, protection for that. We get people reach out to us relatively often about getting fired for, I would say probably violating a social media policy is one of like a pretty common one. And, there's not much you can do about that.
Yep, totally agree. All right, let's wrap it up here. Anything else before we end it for today?
Do we want to talk about well, I guess we did our non sequitur with the Nestle CEO, but we had the Vampire Diaries, equal pay.
I think we'll save that for next week because we're running late on our episode length. So I think
Um,
we'll
I
we'll
just
bring that up next
wanted to
week.
talk about that. All right, I will save my Vampire Diaries information as well as pop culture update regarding one of the stars of that for the next time.
All right. Well, hopefully the takeaway here is let cooler heads prevail when it comes to social media posts, if nothing else, but for your own self-interest. But again, thanks for listening. If you have enjoyed this or you like listening, please like, share, and subscribe. We will be back again next week with another episode. Until then, if you have questions, you can hit us up on Instagram at litigious, and we will see you soon.